So last Wednesday we had, wow, I just feel like I'm falling apart. Last Wednesday we had a lovely gathering here for Ash Wednesday, and we listened to scripture readings and poetry, and we sang a soulful, spiritual, and we planted a seed that we hope will bloom by Holy Week. We each planted a seed in these little cups, which I'm sure some of you have done something like this before. But so Wes then made fun of me at the end. He was like, you know, you can go down to the corner market that has a garden center and you can buy a big bag of potting soil for $2. And because I had read that this particular seed you need to use bad soil for, so I took it quite literally, and so I brought this bucket of very bone-dry, clumpy soil and then a little bit of mulch mixed into it. So it better grow, because I can't have Wes holding this over my head for the rest of my time here. Because a lot of you know that I'm really bad at growing plants and things, and so these better work. I have hope. But we won't know whether these instructions are correct for a while, right? Or if I happen to know how to get a hold of such terrible soil, nothing will grow from it. We won't know until something starts to push through it, right? The soil is silent on this. So we water it daily, we set the cup in a sunny window, speak lovingly to it. Does anybody else do that? Speak to their plants? Please grow. Still and silent. Silence is hard. Silence when we don't know whether the plant's going to come up and we really want it to grow. Vegetation, farmers know this well. But we don't like silence ourselves, and we don't like to be quiet for too long. It's uncomfortable, sometimes painful. When we're in one another's company, it's often a race to see who can fill the space up with something to talk about. We have grown accustomed to find anything if only we don't have to be reminded of the silence. Because I just might have to think about what's really going on inside. Silence leaves us vulnerable to the deeper and darker thoughts that we might have. But we can't hear anything if we don't listen. Makes sense, right? And it's only when we're willing to meet whatever it is that we find in that silence, in all of its sometimes frightening discomfort, watered by our attention, that something might grow out of the deep, dark, and even clumpy soil. Humphrey Travelin, I don't even really know what he is, but he said a beautiful thing. He argued that great artists must have the courage to despair, that they must be shaken by the naked truths that will not be comforted. And he calls it divine discontent. And I love that phrase. This divine discontent, this disequilibrium, this state of inner tension is the source of artistic energy. It's what makes us creative. It's what makes us human. So the poet and novelist May Sarton, she speaks more to this solitude, and she struggled a lot with depression, in fact, a deep depression. And it seems like all the great artists and painters and poets and whatnot, that's a big thing that they dealt with. She says, my need to be alone is balanced against my fear of what will happen when suddenly I enter the huge empty silence if I cannot find support there. Because we're left alone in that silence, right? She says, if I go up to heaven and down to hell in an hour, and then I can keep alive only by imposing upon myself inexorable routines. So she has to be intentional about keeping routines or she will stay down there in the depths of hell. And then specifically concerning her depression, she says, the value of solitude, one of its values, is of course that there's nothing to cushion us against the attacks from within. There's nothing that can keep us from knowing the pain or the discomfort of what it is that happens in silence. Just as there's nothing to help balance at times of particular stress or depression. A few moments of desultory conversation may calm an inner storm, but the storm, painful as it is, might have had some truth in it. So sometimes one has simply to endure a period of depression for what it may hold of illumination, of what we can be illuminated by, if one can live through it, attentive to what it exposes or demands. So even in what may be painful, we can find truth, and only in the silence can we find that truth. So when we move through the Lenten season and try to make sense of what we're even to do, right, in the faithfulness to these liturgical practices, what does it mean that it's Lent? One of the first things we talk about is giving something up. And I've talked with a lot of people telling me what they're giving up. It can be useful to do this for sure, but as I mentioned on Ash Wednesday, the relatively benign discomfort of going without a thing adds nothing to the work that Jesus has already done by his death, life, death, and resurrection. And then, so when we speak of sin, this is what God means by sin. What God seems to indicate when sin is named: broken relationships. It's a broken relationship with God, with each other. When I've turned to other things to satisfy my need for God, I never feel at home with myself because I'm made to be in relationship with God. And silence then becomes a deafening scream for that reconciliation. To stop looking for anything, everything that might make everything okay, but it can't. So the Gospel of John, that Kelly read so beautifully, is very intentional about describing this relationship. John conveys the narrative of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection in a starkly different manner than the other three Gospel writers. In fact, he seems to disregard any sense of linear movement in the life and ministry of Jesus. And I find this very refreshing because I am no linear thinker. I love John for that. But this meandering way of telling the gospel story also invites us to notice what John might be telling us merely by the placement of the narratives in light of the Jewish tradition and the practices of that time. So today's readings tell of two social settings where signs and ceremonies, it talks a lot about signs and ceremonies in John, where they have high significance. The animal sacrifices, they're essential to temple worship. And a wedding without wine would be a total disaster for some people. So at the Ash Wednesday service, I invited us to consider Lenten practice from a new perspective. Rather than responding to the shame of God's judgment, understand this judgment to indicate discernment, this discerning process. That is, versus trying to cut out something or do something that might appease God or ourselves when Jesus already covered everything. Instead, make space and time to discern God's movement in us and around us. making silence integral to the process. So maybe the giving up is giving up something that is distracting us to that silence and adding this time and space of silence. Making silence an art form. And this is what we're going to attempt to do on Wednesday evenings for the next few weeks. In silence, we find the space to recreate perspective. So judgment is no longer something that we fear. Time and space. At this moment of being silent in Jesus' presence, that brings Mary to herself, to the reality that all will be well. Timeless, suspended senses, silent for what must have been to everyone just a moment. Because in the very next verse, she tells the servants to listen to Jesus and do what he says. The words in these two verses don't really make sense to us unless we understand the important directive here, and that is that we listen to Jesus. So the servants, like Mary, they must stop and suspend their frenzy to find more wine, to address the hysterical commands of these parents that are demanding and give all of their attention to Jesus. Because they could, lose their jobs or worse if they didn't find what it is that they demanded of him. Without listening to Jesus, they would never have followed what Jesus asked them to do. And he asked them to fill 6 stone jars that can hold 20 to 30 gallons with water. What a waste of time. And to what end? But they do it. They pause. So can you imagine stone jars filled with 30 gallons of water and having to navigate all of that, not knowing what is going to happen? They pause. They tune out the drama of high society hosts who cannot bear the humiliation of not having enough wine for the reception. And a miracle happens. So when we come to the second narrative in John, it concerns this liturgical meeting space of God's covenant community, the synagogue, the place where we meet together as a covenanting community. Again, there's frenzy of buying and selling the animals that they'll be used for sacrificial rituals. They needed that for sure. But they miss the point entirely. They're trying to do everything they can to keep the synagogue running in a way that others are doing it. Everybody's doing it. To do worship just like all the other synagogues in town. And Jesus had to tear the place apart before they would stop and listen and notice. Notice God incarnate, Jesus in their midst. But these were not signs for those involved in the narratives. These were not signs for the parents of the wedding couple or the friends and family or those who were buying and selling in the temple, but for the disciples, so that they would believe Jesus is who he said he was. So they would listen, so they would be silent and stop making assumptions, but truly hear. This unreflective practice, this is what I'm always doing that. I don't know about you, but I don't reflect on things oftentimes before I start getting agitated about something. This unreflected practice with the wedding and at the temple speaks to the economic, to the political, and to the religious. When rituals and ceremonies are practiced without reflection, when we come and we take communion together without reflection, when we are overwhelmed by entering these rituals in a manner that everyone else is compelled to do, we need to do it in the way everybody else is doing it, we miss the point entirely. And we reveal our lack of faith, our belief that Jesus is who he says he is. Savior, Redeemer, God incarnate. When we take out major loans to put on a wedding just because everyone else makes it this extraordinarily lavish event, And how many are staying married anyway? Oh, is that pessimistic? To spend thousands of dollars on this ceremony because everybody else is doing it. When we're overwhelmed by dwindling numbers in our pews and in our bank account, frantic, compelled to do church like the one down the street who has a really great worship band. We need silence. We need to be still. We need to listen to the heart of God in our particular situation. We need to listen, notice, and then look again to discern what's going on here. Not blaming others, not judging. God is the only one who has the capacity to pass judgment, but discerning. This is what we have, the spirit of discernment in us. It's a gift. And it can be scary, and it can be terrifying. Because in my solitude, I have to ask, what is my part in this? So let us practice just for a moment. I'll read the short meditation that's in this book. It's just this little book, The Art of Lent, and this is what I'm kind of going through, and it's just a short meditation. And it's actually for tomorrow's, but this is the art that is pictured for tomorrow. Look at it. Just allow your eyes to just be drawn to it and not be distracted by anything else other than seeing, praying with it, and hearing this meditation, and allow the Spirit of God to speak. The capacity for silence, a deep, creative awareness of one's inner truth, is what distinguishes us as human. All of us, however ordinary or flawed, have a heart, seemingly boundless longing for fulfillment. And it is their consciousness of this that makes Rembrandt's portrait so beautiful. The Woman with a Pink is what it's entitled. The Woman with a Pink is lost in the depths of her private reflections. Her dark background is symbolically unimportant. The background doesn't matter, lending greater expression to the soft brightness that plays on her face. Visibly silent, she is explicitly encountering the mystery of being human. She doesn't contemplate the carnation, the pink, usually an emblem of love, but she looks within in silence, quiet, and engrossed. Profound silence. Let us notice that which is within us, rather than the flower that will wilt and crumble. Let us dig deep into the dry, clumpy soil and tend it, water it. Let us first be silent, even jolted out of our frenzied worry, and turn our face to Jesus and believe. May we recreate a perspective unique to us, to our situation, first in silence. It's an art form, the art of silence. Amen.